So thanks everyone for your continued involvement in this, and we've had, I think, a lot of great discussion this afternoon. I think we've got some additional things that we can discuss still with the decision tree, and then we're going to have Roxy come up and give us a nice recap, and then she's going to be the one that solves the problem of how to communicate this out to the public. So I think before, I've got another couple questions that I have written down, but I think maybe before we get too much further, I think one of the things I really wanted to get out of this workshop was to have alignment on the decision tree, or at least ideas about what needs to change about the decision tree before we would go forward with the publication. So maybe before we start with anything else, if anyone has any other comments or questions or concerns about the dynamics of how the decision tree is laid out, maybe we can start with those, and then we'll get into more discussion from there.
Hi, thank you for really nice discussions. I actually had a question about the decision tree and maybe how this could be helpful looking at the EPI studies that are looking at dietary acrylamide and cancer, but they show inconclusive results. So you have a variety of studies saying no associations. However, you have a handful of studies that show indeed increased risk. So how do you think would this be helpful sort of to tease that apart?
I'm not sure it can, to be honest. I think this is really dealing with potential risk rather than actual risk. And I think trying to pin down what the actual risk is on something like acrylamide, which is prevalent in most people's diet, is very, very difficult. And my reading of the evidence, we reviewed it with an epidemiology colleague for that study I showed you, was that there was no good evidence at all that at the present, that we can see a signal at present levels of acrylamide exposure in the population, the consumer population, which isn't to say there isn't an effect, it simply is very, very difficult to see it, if there is one. So I don't think that should stop us from developing a strategy to mitigate, if necessary, based on the toxicology and the exposure.
So maybe let me ask it in a slightly different way. So we don't necessarily have anything on here that calls out epidemiological data. Is there a need to do that, or is that really just get encompassed with the other places where we identify doing an evaluation of the risk? I mean, I guess my initial thought is that EPI data would be considered as part of the risk assessment, but do we necessarily need to call it out as something differently?
I think what you could argue is that it's a reality check. In other words, if you've got an exposure which is consistent with what one you would expect to see an effect, and you've got the EPI data telling you whether or not there is an effect, a significant risk, then that's a reality check on whether you've got a problem or not. But the difficulty is, of course, the exposures are likely to be low relative to those that you could detect an effect at. But that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't be taking action. So I think in many cases the epidemiology is not going to help.
So it sounds like, so we've got this box that says, does current exposure represent a health risk? Maybe that's really where
you'd use it, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I just clarify here though, because there's two different sorts of epidemiology data that may be relevant. There may be data on the substance from, say, workplace exposures. I think there are such for acrylamide. But you're talking about studies of the actual product, which have a different place. I would think the first would have some role in the toxicology evaluation generally. They'd have to have some role. I don't know whether I don't think they show causation either, but if they did, they would play a role. But that's different from the reality check I think you're talking about, where you're looking at the actual food product. Yeah. Is that right? Do I understand what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But if you had good epidemiology on exposure to a process-formed compound, which showed a significant risk in the human population at a given exposure level, then most of this decision tree would be unnecessary. You know your target is, because you know what your exposure is and you know what you've got to get down to get rid of to remove the risk.
Yeah.
So it would short circuit a lot of this.
Okay. More comments on the decision tree in general? Got one more? At least one more?
Yep.
Ron Lawrenson from FDA. Alan, did you, I haven't read all through this, okay, it's complicated and it's new, I guess, to all of us, sort of. But did you consult any decision framework type people in coming up with this, or have you? Or if you haven't, could we?
So the framework was actually something that we just developed as part of the food chemical safety group at ILSI. So we've given it to Alan, but so what kind of person, I guess, particular are you thinking of? All right, I have an easy answer, which is no, we didn't go outside of ILSI.
I was waiting for that. I think it's maybe something that could be thought about, because there are people that are, do this kind of stuff, and they understand the probabilities and the statistics, et cetera. Might be able to flesh it out a little bit. The question I had was, there are a number of steps in here where they're essentially yes, no, yes, no answers are not without uncertainty. Okay, and in fact, they have the largest consequences if you're wrong. Okay, and I was wondering, have you, in other words, there are if there's a chance of being wrong, there are consequences for how this goes. And is there any way to fold that into this?
Yeah,
that's why I'm thinking maybe someone who understands frameworks could do that.
Well, we did actually I think we solved this problem with the WHO Human Relevance Framework when we revised it in 2014, because that was exactly the concern. We had yes or no. And what it really was yes and not yes. In other words, if you were absolutely sure or reasonably sure, you go one way, and if it was reasonably sure or doubtful, you'd go the other way. And that is, as you say, has to be reflected in the text around uncertainty and in what is the confidence you need to go in one direction or the other. And we'll need to capture that.
Okay, well, that sounds like a place to go.
Yeah.
Let me just add one comment on the framework. I'm quite sure this is generally consistent with the science and decisions framework. If we had maybe a clearer statement of the problem up front. The only area that might not be consistent is where there are steps in which you establish, as you go through the process, whether you have a significant risk reduction or not. That's a decision that would, in the science and decisions framework, would not be made during the analytical process, but only after you've done it all. There's no risk management decision in the risk assessment, phase 2 of the science and decision framework. It's purely an analysis of risk and risk changes, risk reductions with different interventions. Then you look at the whole thing and make decisions. So that part of it might be inconsistent, but otherwise it is, I think, generally quite consistent.
What you would have to do for this then is do what we did with the FSUB risk-benefit tiered approach, which is that after each iteration, each stage which requires risk management input, is you actually go to the risk management, get the decision, and then proceed. Because if you have to wait to the end, you're stuck with 100 or 200 compounds. Right. What you want to do is be able to narrow that down, and then so we may need to write in that sort of iterative risk assessment management interaction.
Although I will say on that point, I don't think the science and decisions frame, I worked on that, the report, I don't think it was intended to do this sort of prioritization.
That's what
There's no reason why it shouldn't, but the intent was really to look at an individual compound or a group of related compounds and then to work through the process with those, not to make prioritization decisions. It's really not set up that way. So this might be just fine.
Alison?
So looking at the agenda for this section, you had asked, what are the areas where criteria need to be developed and the identification of high-risk compounds. So my question is, FSMA, under the new law, the Food Safety Modernization Act, we have to prioritize, or FDA has to provide a list of high-risk chemicals. Is there any overlap in that effort that would help to prioritize within this decision tree specific chemicals?
Well, that work is underway. There is a work group developing the list of contaminants. I don't know exactly where that work group is. I think there may have been one public meeting about it, if I'm not mistaken, or there will be one if there hasn't been one. So I don't know. I think that list will be about known chemical contaminants, high risk. I think we're talking about here a lot of compounds that are possibly high risk, but we don't know yet. So I don't know. There may not be an intersection between the two necessarily.
Can I just
Yeah.
interject a little question for Nega? Because I meant to ask you this earlier, because you called this class of compounds contaminants. Do you use that word in the way I use that word? I don't consider them contaminants.
We handle them as the same way we handle contaminants, but no, they're not contaminants in the sense that, arsenic or lead, environmental contaminants.
When you say you handle them, what does that mean?
Well, in terms of, safety assessment and so on,
Yeah.
they're not added, so
Yeah.
they're not handled by the Office of Food Additive
Okay,
Safety.
that's what you mean. Okay, fine.
So hi, Kelly McGurney, ConAgra Foods. So I wanted to ask about the mitigation plans area and wondering about complexity of mitigation plans and whether or not we need to prioritize our efforts related to how complex they would be relative to the fact we may have hundreds of chemicals to address, and we're really trying to understand what those secondary effects look like, and based on our experience with acrylamide, do we need to incorporate that into our decision making?
All right, so I think that's a good question. I think Nega did a very nice job of outlining what a lot of the different mitigation efforts are, and I think it's clear that you can have a really complicated matrix if you're talking about all the different things that you can do to mitigate. So, so prioritize. So your question is really more around: do we want to prioritize compounds based on the mitigation plans that we would implement?
Yeah, the complexity of the plan and the relative costs associated. So as one of our decision criteria in the overall risk mitigation effort, when we're prioritizing the chemical list based on hazard, is that another consideration that we really need to be making, especially if we may need to address hundreds of chemicals.
It's a policy decision, I think. How much you spend on mitigation is not for the risk assessor to judge. We can evaluate. I think the beauty of this proactive approach is it allows you to predict the likely impact of your interventions, and then based on the likely impact and the relative risk reduction and the cost and the secondary consequences, a decision has to be made of which, if any, of those strategies is going to be followed. But I think all one can do as a scientist is present as much information as possible with the related uncertainties, and then say, well, we're happy to discuss it, but this is what we've got. I can't see how we could impose a scientific solution. One of the things that I didn't say, which I meant to say, was on the risk-benefit side, the composite metrics are based on direct health effects. But of course, one might want to include indirect benefits and risks, and then you need another metric which is often monetary. So you convert a quality or a daily into a cash value, and then you can incorporate other socioeconomic factors into that calculation, which allows you to offset some of the benefits and risks more comprehensively.
Right.
But one more comment on this question on, I don't know much about mitigation strategies and so forth, but I do know that at least some subset of this class of substances are substances that are formed from things that we do add to food. Now, I know the case of the nitrates and nitrites I mentioned earlier, they create nitrosamines, at least under some conditions. and they would not be created unless the nitrites and nitrates were added. And I don't know how many other substances might be in this class, but that seems to me signals a different kind of way of thinking about possible mitigation than other cases where they're truly a matter of the chemistry of cooking or whatever it is. This is influenced by the addition of certain materials. So that might be one thing you'd want to break out and look at that as a separate category. It may be nothing more than the nitrite class, but there may be others as well that are like that.
Heidi?
So I have a question that really might be more of an education for me. Mike, something that I've been reflecting on that you had mentioned in your presentation was the relation between the EDI and the ADI. So if the EDI is below the ADI, everyone's happy. If the EDI is way above the ADI, we're all concerned. But for the world that we're working in, we're kind of around the ADI to some extent. So in reflecting on the second box here, which is prioritizing compounds for evaluation based on margin of exposure, my question is has there been any studies out there looking at excursions above the TDI or the ADI and the impacts thereof? And as I ask this, I'm wondering if I'm answering my own question, because if there were, maybe we wouldn't be here today. But I'm wondering, historically, do we have anything, or has that been looked at that might help us to better prioritize ourselves, so to speak, within that second box? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well,
I love the phrase excursions above the ADI. I've been hearing that in Jack for 20 years now. It's great. It's a great phrase. I'm not aware of anything, though.
Well, I remember ILSI Europe 20 years ago asked me to give a talk on the consequences of excursions above the ADI, and I didn't have much to say about it. And I don't know of many studies, but I will make a point, which is that there is no single answer to that at all. Yeah. It is entirely substance specific, because it depends upon what the ADI is based on. What is the toxicological profile? What's the dose-response relationship? What's the time-response relationship for that? What is the subgroup sensitivity relationship? It will vary with the compound. It will vary with the extent and duration of excursion above the ADI. There is an activity which is not a million miles away from this question, ongoing this year at JMPR, which is to look at the issue of what is the right marriage between the exposure assessments and the toxicological studies, by which I mean we use the estimate of chronic exposure, and then we assume that we're protecting all exposure durations except acute, where we have a different consideration. And there's evidence that may not be the case, and it's a peculiarity of the way we average the exposure at JMPR. In other words, you can have a short-term exposure above the EDI, which will be averaged out over a lifetime. The question is the toxicology consistent with that? And so we're looking at that. But the answer, I don't think, has been any. It's difficult to see how one would get good data on it, I have to say. So you'll be looking for subtle effects in population. So I suspect it's difficult to get the information. But I think, also, as I said, it's very case specific.
So before I get to your question, Monsi, if I can just build on this a little bit, and I think this came up in a number of conversations I had at the break, which is, I think we can get pretty good alignment on if we have a bright line of 10,000 of an MOE for a genotoxic compound, or 100 for a non-genotoxic compound, or an ADI, TDI is established. If you can go from one end of the one side of the bright line to the other, that seems like that would be a significant impact on health. So what if you have a non-genotoxic compound and you go from 20 to 60? So when we're not crossing a bright line, do we need more research to say what is a significant impact when you're not crossing those bright lines? Or how do you handle that when there's not a clear finish line you're crossing?
Well, I did try to address that, because that's where I think there will be, there may be policy targets where there would be the judgment that that is actually a significant change. And you would need to do it using a model of the impact on incidence and effect. So you'd have to ask, how much of a change in health is that likely to make? You know, we saw it on the aflatoxin that Mike showed that you could see, you can model it to some extent. So if I was able to move the marginal exposure from 20 to 60 for my compound, is that going to be a meaningful change? Even although I'm not getting above the bright line, it might be sufficient of a change that I feel it has an impact on public health, because it's going to bring in, it's going to shift the population distribution curve for health impact.
Yeah, and I, again, as a non-toxicologist, I would argue that that part of the dose response, when you're going from a low MOE to a slightly higher, is more important
Absolutely.
than when you're higher
Yeah.
up. So, yeah. But
Sure, on
again,
that steep
without
path.
knowing all that information, it's hard to say
Yeah.
what you're looking at. Yeah.
Well, I just add that if you mean, Alan, convert it to a quantitative measure of risk,
Yes.
I think that can be done,
Yeah.
then I think you have an answer to the
Well,
question.
that's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah, okay. I agree with that.
With appropriate uncertainty built
Yes.
in. No, but in this case, there would be significant.
Okay, can I just say something? We are never going to say yes or no up here without
Of course not.
doing all that stuff.
We're trained not to say yes or no.
That's correct.
All right, Monty.
Mansi Krishnan from ILSI North America. So we've been discussing how to evaluate the effect of mitigating process-formed compounds. And there was a discussion that these compounds could be naturally occurring and they might not necessarily be formed during the process, cooking, etc. And the scope of this framework is exposure through oral route only. But if we were to evaluate the effect of mitigation, and if we are looking at health effects, then the exposure could be from other routes as well. How would you say that you are exclusively looking at oral route exposure, so-and-so health effect, or if there is a better way to quantify the effect, how would we just say that it is oral route only and we're excluding the naturally occurring compounds, exposure is not through those, and the health effect might be from other compounds which we did not mitigate or which are already there. So we are putting this framework together, looking at all the steps, but I think cumulative effect of many other things might be a consideration when we.
So, yeah, I think that's a really good point, and probably a good clarification we're going to have to put in there that I think we want to consider all the exposure that one would happen. I think the mitigations that we're proposing are focused on, and maybe somebody will correct me on this one too, but I think the mitigations we're really talking about are focused on food and oral exposure to these compounds. So acrylamide, again, being everyone's favorite example, while the best way to mitigate against it may be to get everyone to quit smoking, the purpose of our framework, of our decision tree, of this work is not to tell people to stop smoking. It's about, is any mitigation based on talking about controlling acrylamide exposure in the food supply going to have a beneficial effect? And part of that is going to have to consider that smoking is a huge source of acrylamide exposure. So we definitely want to consider it. It's just, I think maybe the mitigation plans are not going to be focused on it, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think what you want to be careful of is when you're looking at these things and you have information and know where your other sources of exposure are, that the message that goes out, the communication is not to get people, as a regulator, we wouldn't say you should all stop smoking. We do say you should all stop smoking, that's a different story. But if you're not a smoker, you can reduce this 50%. If you are a smoker, you can reduce it 2% from our end, not from the consumer's end. You know, it depends on the circumstance. The methylmercury example, you know, stop eating fish, you will lower significantly your level of methylmercury, and that's a consumer choice. This goes back to what we were saying before. So those things, you know, you can't load every possible case into the framework of the discussion, but these need to be noted down the road.
Yeah.
Jiuni Kello Company. So further down the decision tree, there's a box for asking does post-mitigation exposure have significant reduction of risk compared to current exposure? So I guess, and the question is really focusing on exposure to process-formed compounds. But even I'm questioning, do we really want to handle chemical by chemical or groups of chemicals by groups of chemicals? Because even last night I heard from like Francisco, acrylamide as an example, when you are trying to reduce acrylamide level, like in cookies, using one of the toolbox, then yes, acrylamide level will go down, but your furan level will go up, and some other chemicals. So it's not even about other secondary effects, but impact to or exposure to other formed compounds. So do we really need to look at compound by compound, or just multiple compounds formed from one process in one food?
So I think some of that we can handle with the secondary effects.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
part of that can get caught in there. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about it as a group, because I think the more discussion that we're having, the more it's sounding like one large bolus of compounds that all get evaluated in a similar time, because you're not going to understand those secondary effects without understanding what's going on with those other chemicals. But I think for the most part, those secondary effects should pick up things like that, especially known ones. For example, the furans with the acrylamide example.
I would regard that very much as a secondary risk.
Yeah.
As a consequential risk, which you would certainly want to identify and take full account of.
No, it's
So
a good
following
note,
with
though.
June's question, would that look like in the decision tree I don't think we can see it. Yeah, we can. It says evaluate secondary effects of mitigation efforts. That line of thinking would take you in a circular pattern back up to understanding the health risk.
Of the other compound?
Of the other compound. And then back down to the risk-benefit aspect of comparing and contrasting.
Could you?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's going to be
Choose your own adventure.
it's the problem with having to manage 800 compounds. I mean, because they're all going to be interconnected. And it really is one of the objectives of this workshop too, was to highlight that to everyone here. I think everyone here is pretty aware of it, but mitigating against a single compound has ramifications that you may or may not understand. And I think we've heard that from a number of the people in the audience today. So it's not as easy as saying, okay, let's get rid of acrylamide now, because there may be other things going on.
But just to point out that the risk-benefit frameworks allow the possibility of calculating the net health impact of your intervention. And it would incorporate both acrylamide and furan if you have the data.
Andy?
That's a perfect place on the slide. In the occupational hygiene community, they've also been developing a lot of these kind of frameworks lately. And one of the areas that's been added to the sort of traditional paradigm, which used to be sort of recognition, evaluation, control, they've added confirm. So I'm wondering if there's a confirm loop here, kind of in the NAS framework as well, kind of going back to mitigation efforts. Now we've done something, have we gone looped back to verify that it has actually mitigated the risk?
I think that's I think that's a really good point, and I think that is, and maybe we can have Sue or someone come up from ILSI Europe, because I believe that's the framework that they've developed. So they've developed an evaluation tool to look at what are the impacts of mitigation, and they ran through examples of DON and methylmercury and furans actually. But to add that here, or at least note it as part of this process, I think that's a really good idea.
But what did they confirm? That they've reduced exposure? I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm assuming they didn't confirm a reduction of health impact.
It could be that, but it could loop back up to confirm at the end you'd go back to does current exposure, the new current exposure, represent a health risk? Because you basically modified the exposure term, right?
No, I was
But
just
haven't you done that
in the
in
case
the-
studies that ILSI Europe did, whether they looked at exposure or not? And
I don't want to put you on the spot, Sue, but do you want to talk about, kind of what you've found in the ILSI Europe work?
I mean, this is theoretical, and then that would be confirmed.
So we
We looked at 3 case studies, Dawn, methylmercury, and Furan. And really sort of the take-home messages, without going into all the detail, is the uncertainty around the exposure data and also the impact of measuring the mitigation were quite significant, and therefore making judgments on the success of your mitigation were not really that straightforward, in a nutshell. But important considerations, taking into account the uncertainty in your initial exposure assessment and how that would impact on your ability to measure an impact of your mitigation via a revised exposure assessment. Also things like the consumer advice on methylmercury targeted at pregnant women. Do you actually have the data set that enables you to draw conclusions around the impact in that particular subgroup of the population? So it was really try to get people to think and illustrate that when you're thinking about mitigation measures, the effectiveness of mitigation measures, you need to do a lot of careful thought beforehand as to how you're actually going to define the success of that mitigation measure.
Thanks, Sue.
So, I don't think we've discussed this at all, but I'm fascinated at the difference between individuals and populations. So when you're looking at something like methylmercury, where an individual can make a choice and decide, you'll never have a population measure of whether that's successful or not, but logically, I can sit here and feel comfortable if I say, well, if you stopped eating swordfish steaks, you're definitely going to have a potential, maybe not a potential benefit, but you're removing a potential harm, let's say that way. But we'll never be able to measure that, I don't think, on an epidemiological basis. It's a big difference. So for me, it raises the question, is the sense here, and the word significant troubles me in all of these things. As you said, it was policy, but I mean, here in the US, a little less of something bad is always better. I mean, if you want to turn it around the other way, and Dennis has probably heard me say this before, can you imagine a politician in this country listening to us talking about the Delaney Clause and say, yeah, it's okay to leave a little carcinogen purposely put in the food? It's never, ever, ever going to happen, no matter how much data we give them. So, you see, that's a problem. Significant is a subtle, it depends on the individual rather than the population. It's significant to me. It's not necessarily significant overall. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
No, I didn't say anything because Roxy's going to solve that in the final presentation. It's going to be one of the biggest challenges that we have coming out of putting forth an idea like this is how do you convince people exactly that? Like, you know what? We did it. We looked at everything here, and we didn't find a significant impact. And I mean, yeah, I understand and I agree with your hesitation at the word significant because it's great.
We live in a society that doesn't want to reduce the speed limit.
Yep.
But these are, thankfully, not decisions for the scientist. So in other words, we can tell the risk manager, the policymaker, is going to take $100 million to reduce exposure 1% with a probably undetectable impact on health. But if you feel you've got to stand up and justify this to your voters, and you want to spend that money, then that's your choice. Yeah. But remember, you're going to the polling booth eventually, and we'll vote accordingly on whether you've used our money wisely or not.
I mean, isn't it the regulator's job or other policymakers to decide what level of risk we're going to tolerate in different circumstances? Zero risk is not usually an option. So you've got to make those very hard decisions and justify them.
Right, I agree. All we can do here is the science part.
Yeah. And in fact, the reality is in other parts of regulation, these decisions are made. So we're always told about road safety, putting up crash barriers, and they do a calculation, how much is it going to cost to save a life? And and if it exceeds a certain value, they will not put the money in. Nobody's ever told us.
You just did.
But it's just, but this is, well, because you can't spend unlimited amounts of money.
Right.
You know, if it's going to take billions and billions of dollars to save normally one life, you're not going to, and then, or you've got an alternative that you can spend that money on. And these are hard decisions that decision makers have to take.
You should focus all their money on micro. All right, Sachin, you want to go?
Hi, this is Sachin Usari from Coca-Cola. So my question is regarding prioritizing compounds for evaluation. So like I want to discussion around like use of mechanistic like gene expression transcriptomic data. You have I just heard like we have 200 heat form toxicants, and based on this high throughput transcriptomic or similar kind of data, do a unsupervised clustering approach to see if this unknown compound falls or is clustering with a like a pH type of compound or a acrylamide, just like and bit of association, and then prioritize your list, and then like based on like top 5, top 10, go for like exposure assessment or. So just I wanted to get your thoughts on those kind of approaches, like even a talks, and I know that at NTP they are using this kind of just for prioritization for further testing.
I think that's exactly the way we're going to have to go, and we can use chemometric approaches as well. You know, quasars and more sophisticated approaches to try to identify what is the likely tox profile based on structural analogy to other compounds. And as you say, we can use toxicogenomics, we can use high throughput screening, we can use high content screening, we can use, you know, as I say, in silico approaches. There's a variety of approaches being developed which are now reaching, at least in terms of clustering for prioritization, a reasonable level of confidence.
That's true, and
Absolutely.
that would like shorten our list of compounds. Thanks.
Chuck Spritsky, University of Wisconsin. In regards to the discussion about what the public and politicians might be willing to spend, I wonder if it isn't considerably higher than what we're saying. If you use the microbiological criteria, Listeria monocytogenes, for example, we have zero tolerance in meat products. CDC estimates we have 1,600 cases a year. FoodNet says we probably have a couple hundred confirmed cases, and although those can be severe and very costly, what industry spends in terms of recalls and preventative measures is very, very high. And I don't see any impetus on the microbiological one that people can go the other direction. Now, the difference is that bug is currently regulated. Here we're talking about things one might do. But I wonder if there might not be political pressure and public pressure to really be very stringent on some of these compounds, even if the risk we might decide is fairly low, because certainly we're doing it in other aspects of life.
There might be. I mean, I come from a part of the world where we saw a political avalanche, upheaval last week, which defied all logic. But I do think that decisions made by regulators and government have to reflect, at the end of the day, the will of the people. What is the appetite and tolerance of the public for certain decisions? Now, you can have an administration that is ultra-conservative in its decision-making, and that's their prerogative. You know, that's what they're in the position to do. The scientists can only give them what the evidence they've got, and the decisions have made accordingly. But at the end of the day, as a society, we have to ask, how much resource are we going to spend on chasing things which are really not meaningfully impacting on human health in any way whatsoever? And I think some of the things, not necessarily what we're talking about today, but some of the things that are being regulated in some parts of the world are so trivial that they're just consuming resource and money unnecessarily. And that is a resource that could be used better for the good of society. And as a citizen and a scientist, I do feel strongly about that. And I will speak out about it, and I will try and campaign to get more evidence-based, logical decision-making at all levels of government.
I agree with you, but we live in a communication service. Maybe our last speaker.
No, and I accept that. As I said, you know, that is the prerogative of the decision maker. They were their voted representatives, or elected representatives, and at the end of the day, that they will make that decision.
So have any more comments from the audience or even the panel on the decision tree? I have a couple of things that I wrote down, and maybe I'll just throw them out at this point, and we can look for some more feedback. So I think a couple of the themes that I've heard recurring are, there's pretty good support for the decision tree, but it does need some work in some areas. I think some of the things we heard were prioritization, so finding a way to prioritize the compounds, and maybe we're not there yet in terms of being able to put forth a process of prioritizing every compound, but I think there were some good ideas that were thrown out. Tiered approach is another thing that I heard for the top of the decision tree, is find a way to use a tiered approach where it's again back to prioritization, but can you have a tiered approach where you're going to look at different levels of information for different tiers of compounds? And then I think the one thing that I have written down for the bottom is, and not to make Mike Denobi mad again, but the definition of significant impact on health. So can we get alignment on what would be classified as a significant impact on health? And we have bright line examples where I think it can be pretty clear. And then I think there may be more research needed as what do you do in those cases where there's not a bright line to go across? What do you do in those gray areas? Going from 30 to 60, going from 80 to 92, I mean, what are those MOEs actually, what kind of impact do they have? So those are the big ideas that I had written down, and I don't know if people have comments on that or other discussion points that they want to field before we ask Roxy to get up.
I guess one comment. Well, now we're talking about avoidable versus unavoidable. Is that going to be also?
Yeah, I think that's another good point too. So I think we should definitely include some discussion of does this really make sense for, and maybe I'll pose that to the panel too. So if we're really going to go for processed compounds and expand it out to things that are not readily avoidable, are there any changes that we need to see here? And in terms of either exposure assessments or mitigation efforts, does that change for something like lead? Where I'm not even sure what the mitigation would be to get away from lead in the food supply.
So the question is,
would it be different for processed form compounds like acrylamide versus something like arsenic or lead?
I don't think it would.
I think they're pretty much
the
same logic.
Yeah.
I think would apply.
I agree.
You may not find ways to mitigate in many cases with contaminants, but the same logic of analysis seems to me to apply.
Yeah, when I
These
first
are things hard to avoid.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I first looked at it, I said, well, this can be used for other for lead and arsenic. And in fact, there's a good example in looking at a possible code of practice for reducing arsenic in rice that Codex has embarked on. There are some agronomic practices that if you go too aerobic from the full flood stage, well, yes, you decrease arsenic levels in rice, but cadmium shoots up. So.
So actually, maybe building on that, Nega, do you have feedback from Codex? So what kind of mitigation efforts have been successful on the Codex end? So Codex, I'm under the impression they do two major things. They set MLs and they establish codes of practice. Yeah. Is one approach more successful or has been more successful than the other?
I don't think an evaluation of that has ever been made that I know of. But you're right, our committee does one of two things, code of practice. In fact, we start out generally with code of practice and see what levels emanate from that. You do a survey, and then based on that survey, you establish a maximum level. I don't think there's ever been an evaluation.
I've been reading some books lately, and I think one of the things I read was that people respond to incentives. So when we're evaluating these mitigation efforts, is that something that we need to consider is what kind of mitigation efforts is the public, are companies going to respond to? So companies want incentives to do things. So are there incentives that we can find to establish some of these mitigation programs? Is some of that incentive, again, back to you, Roxy, is some of this incentive easier ways to communicate to the public that, hey, we're doing something?
Well, the thing that the public will never negotiate on is safety. So if they think somebody is being incentivized to make something more safe to them, that's a really bad feeling that they have in their mouth. And then if they hear that somebody is not doing something because the incentive wasn't right and it compromises safety, watch out. Yeah, watch out. One, you were talking about readily avoidable chemicals, and I don't know if I'm understanding exactly what we're versus just avoidable, or versus just chemicals that are there and that are naturally occurring through a chemical process, process. When there's an alternative chemical that can be used that doesn't present the risk or seems more natural, consumers will always want you to utilize that one. And we've seen that with food companies, especially recently, with the proper or improper pressure being put from the bloggers we heard about earlier or others. Azodicarbonamide, food coloring, different chemical input or additives that create some sort of outcome for the product or for an economic benefit will always be chastised, I guess, by the public that assumes that they're only making that decision for their own pocketbook reasons. Another one is when products are banned in other countries that we're, versus utilizing those products here, that's always going to be seen as negative as well.
This was unavoidable, just to be
These
clear.
are unavoidable.
These are unavoidable.
Avoidable, yeah.
Avoidable.
So that you can't say to somebody, leave it out of the food, because
Got it.
that's the one option we don't have.
Readily unavailable, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Is it time to address adversity? I mean, I think this is a parameter that we avoided for 50 plus years. I mean, and we're doing it. I mean, Alan talks about a genotoxic getting 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more of our concern than non-genotoxic. Is that merited? And should we think, if we're doing it here, should we do it more? Or in other words, all these substances that are put into the environment because of processing, or some of them are worse than others, not just in risk, but in what they produce. Do we want to try to integrate that in? We're doing a little bit here, so I'm just bringing this up. I know this is not easy, but if we're doing it so rigidly for genotoxic versus non-genotoxic, when that's putting a whole lot of weight on that gene tox test that it doesn't deserve, frankly. Okay, I mean, do we need to consider this as part of our equation for safety?
My own view is the worst. I have every sympathy with that view, that when you talk about a decision tree for process formed compounds which are in our food, why would we deviate from current practice elsewhere? So that's my so we either change it everywhere or we stick with current practice here. That's I think our main choice. I'd like to change everywhere.
Right, we're a little bit ahead of schedule. Do we have any other comments from the audience? Otherwise, maybe we'll ask Roxy to come up and hopefully recap a lot of this discussion, and then we'll even have a little bit of time at the end for a couple more questions. So,
If you're asking me to fix all the challenges, that might
yes,
be
that is what you're asking. Can we have maybe a round of applause for everyone on the panel and the speakers? Thanks, everybody.